I was just telling Razan that not too many think tanks in Washington cover environmental subjects, but we felt it was time to do so because it's very much a part of what's going on in the region, and especially in the UAE, where you have incredible development, so the challenges are huge. But also because in the case of the UAE, they've really taken some pioneering steps in how they're conserving their natural heritage. Razan Al Mubarak has been very much at the center of all this ever since I met Razan back in 2001. Amazing. Too long ago, when she was with the World Wildlife Fund. And she really is the person who's been at the center of the progress that's been made in the UAE. So I give her a lot of credit for where you are today. Congratulations. Quite an achievement. What we want to do today is maybe cover this in a number of steps, look at the progress on the local level, on the regional level, interacting with other GCC countries and cooperating, and also on the international level. And I think a lot of the exciting work on the international level will be of great interest to all of us. So I think what we're going to do to start off is ask Razan to give us an overview, and then we'll go back and explore some of the issues that she raises, and then over to Fred after that. Razan, I'll turn it over to you.
And really a privilege for me to be part of these lecture series at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. So I wanted to start with my opening remarks just to give you a little bit of context. Let me take you 45 years. Back 45 years. 45 years ago, the 7 sheikdoms on the coastline of the Arabian Peninsula, also known as the Trucial States, agreed on a federal constitution for achieving independence, and with that agreement, a country was born. The United Arab Emirates was established in December 2nd, 1971. 8 years after that, I was born. And my generation was amongst the first generation of Emiratis to be born in hospitals. Prior to that, the small population of Abu Dhabi depended on a single maternity clinic in the oasis village of Al Ain, under the care and compassion of 2 U.S. missionaries, the late Dr. Pat and Marion Kennedy, and who many in the UAE today owe their lives to. You see, the early to mid-20th century period for Abu Dhabi and the Trucial States was a very difficult period. My father's generation were living at a time of great uncertainty and hardship as they experienced a complete collapse of the pearling industry, mainly due to the Japanese innovation of the cultured pearl. And the pearling industry was the only source of income for Abu Dhabi at that time. It was also a time in our history where only half of the babies born survived. 1 in 3 mothers died during childbirth. Malaria, TB, eye diseases were rife, and the population was actually declining. It was only with the discovery of oil that Abu Dhabi and the UAE was given a second chance for prosperity. The founder of the UAE, the late Sheikh Zayed, once said, "He who does not know his past cannot make best of his present and his future, for it's from the past that we learn." So, with the knowledge of the past and a conviction and optimism in the future, the late Sheikh Zayed set a course for the early establishment of the UAE, focused on a future that would be underpinned by a strong federal structure, a future that would provide a strong social fabric strengthened through the provision of the best in healthcare and education, a diversified economy, and a powerful environmental ethos emanating from a generation of resilient Bedouin and fishermen who survived the foreboding nature of the desert. So today, the UAE is the 2nd largest economy in the Arab world, despite its relatively small population. It's ranked 1st in terms of its contribution to foreign aid per GNI. The UAE is host to hundreds of nationalities, and it's this rich blend of cultures that has encouraged the rapid development of the country. Abu Dhabi is home to the first-class educational institute, whether locally bred, like the UAE University, but also NYU, Abu Dhabi, and the Sorbonne. And last year, Cleveland Clinic Hospital opened its doors to patients from across the Middle East. And of course, the subject of our session today, it is home to the largest environmental and conservation organization in the Middle East, the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi, of whom I've had the privilege to lead over the past 4 years. So essentially, I just wanted to give a little bit of context to where we are and the Environment Agency. A lot of the times I'm asked, why is the UAE or why is Abu Dhabi in particular interested in the environment? And it's not something that has been parachuted. It wasn't an imported idea. The Environment Agency actually originated before the country was born. It started as a wildlife ranger force established in the 1960s. And their main task was to monitor wildlife. But as they started to monitor wildlife, they noticed that hunting was reducing their numbers. And in 1974, a few years after the establishment of the Emirates, the hunting law was introduced. And their main mandate was to regulate and enforce the hunting law. In 1976, the first conference that was ever hosted in Abu Dhabi was a conference about the environment. And it was the first conference on falconry that was ever hosted worldwide. In the 80s, and my colleague Fred could tell you a little bit more about that because he had the privilege of help set up the National Avian Research Center dedicated to the conservation of falconry and the Hubara bustard. I'll just keep the mic a little bit closer to you in case you
step in.
You need to step in.
Yeah.
And after the establishment of the National Avian Research Center, the interest went beyond birds and falconry to the conservation of other species. In 2001, when I met Ambassador Marcelle, the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi was renamed. Essentially, it was all these various initiatives finally put in a framework called the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi. But what was unique about it from an environmental perspective is that it combined both the regulation side, but also the conservation side. It tackled both green and brown issues. And really, our mission is to protect the environment, but the essence, it's really for people's well-being, but also for nature. We have around 1,000 employees, and what I find fascinating is almost half of those employees were the employees that were first hired in the 60s to lead the animal welfare wildlife group. And so today, the same organization that's putting regulations on aluminium smelters hosts a history of environmental conservation. Most of them are over the age of 65, and some have their children working with us as well. And so I find that really, really special and unique because it's this diversity of age, of background, but also nationality that makes the Environment Agency a very special place to be. So the UAE and Abu Dhabi in particular, because the Environment Agency's mandate is to conserve the environment in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. But essentially, as you've seen in the video, the main challenges facing the environment is fast-paced development. And so we're at a phase in the development of Abu Dhabi where we're diversifying our economy, where we're building infrastructure. And with that comes, of course, challenges directly affecting wildlife. The Abu Dhabi and, of course, the rest of the Arabian Gulf states are desert environments. And as such, they're actually very, very fragile. We have very little natural capital. So the destruction of the little natural capital we have is very devastating, not only from a wildlife perspective, but also what I hope that I wanted to convey in my introduction is that it's also very much connected to a national identity and a national notion of what makes an Emirati. So really, habitat destruction is a threat. The most important from a biodiversity perspective is our coast. It has the highest sort of biocapacity index when you compare it to other natural ecosystems, and most development is actually happening on the coast. So how do we protect? How do we conserve? And mainly, the way the Environment Agency is approaching this issue is through a monitoring program. So really monitoring in terms of understanding the types of habitats, the types of species that exist in Abu Dhabi. And what we found is, the ecosystems that we have are very unique. So for example, when we look at our coral reefs, of course, all around the world. I don't know if we have any divers amongst us, but they're facing many, many challenges in the context of global warming. As the seas warm up, your corals find a very difficult environment to survive. Now, what's interesting in the Arabian Gulf is you already have corals that live at the threshold of their existence. And therefore, they've adapted over hundreds and hundreds of years to live in a very constrained environment. So as such, what we found is the corals of the Arabian Gulf are a living laboratory of what type of species can exist within a warming world, within a world and an ocean that's becoming more and more acidified. And so that's an area that we're looking not just from a conservation perspective, but also from an international scientific collaboration perspective. Within our monitoring program, we develop an understanding of what we have. And we develop regulations and policies in order for us to protect them. And I'm very happy to say that the figures that were in the videos now have changed. So we're working on a lot of the establishment of protected areas. So today our marine protected area percentage has gone up, and so has our land, protecting our land.
So not only do we have to tackle existing pressure on the environment, we also had to build the governance and the overall management structure to tackle those. So the two goes in parallel. And that's why you have, for example, the Environment Agency is a kind of, in more mature country, would be a kind of an hybrid between several different type of organization. In the US, for example, the Environment Agency will be your US EPA, your Fish and Wildlife, your Park Service, some of the municipalities, and some of the state legislation body. When the Environment Agency was born, for example, no law on the environment did exist. They needed to be drafted, understood, every bylaw needed to be negotiated, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, business went on, development happened, the population keep rising, and so we are basically always trying to catch up at the same time. So that's one key issue, which is not necessarily only in the UAE, but in many developing countries. The difference with the UAE is that the financial and economic power of the country allow the country to develop very, very fast much faster than its institutional setup, and certainly much faster than the local manpower and understanding, because you need also to build your human capacity to deal with these new challenges. The other issue that was very apparent right from the beginning, and that led to a lot of things that the Environment Agency had to do and is still doing, is that there were a very critical lack of understanding of the situation. Baseline issues are totally new for us in the late 80s. Status of fishery stock, for example, was unknown. The quality of our air, the issue on marine environment, nobody knew. I mean, there were some private company, especially the oil and gas sector, who was much more advanced in their understanding of the environmental issues and had some data, but that were not collected in the context of an environmental regulatory body. So we had also to create that body of knowledge, this methodology, these things, without being able to rely on academic institution or researcher or private sector there. So all this combined added a lot of challenges, but also was actually a plus in a way that we had to define a solution that were really a little bit out of the box. We didn't have a template to fit in. So the Environment Agency, as Razan explained, is now a mix of a purely regulatory policy body, but we have also our own researcher describing the environment. We do our own key environmental parameter monitoring. We don't have anybody else to do that for us. We develop our own policies. We have our own legal department to establish and draft new law. So that is seen sometimes as a potential conflict of interest. The positive of that is that we do not have any issue to have science, factual monitoring data making their way right through policies and regulation directly. It's just a colleague who needs to go from one office to the next, and this finding makes its way to a regulation. So challenges, advantages, and the fact that we evolve in a very, very dynamic region came to that. But critical at the beginning, and Razan alluded that what was very different in the UAE is that right from day one, the leadership of the country had the environment at heart right away. Not from a strategic studies or what is a priority, how we can position, what is the niche, but really from an emotional, personal experience and experience on the wildlife and the desert. Simple, but very efficient. So it's very easy to sell environmental responsibility to the decision maker. They don't question that. The challenge is to find solutions and propositions which are able to combine economic development, which in a country like the UAE is a must. There is no choice. In the 50s, 60s, the UAE was one of the poorest countries on earth, as Razan says. So development is a must. There is no issue, no question. However, there is a kind of a combination to find a middle way.
So you're not a federal agency.
No.
How do you coordinate? Coastlines can't be demarcated amongst the Emirates. So how do you coordinate your work with the other Emirates? And also, if you can shed some light on how you work within the GCC, are you, given that you are Emirate and not federal level, do you find it easy to have partnerships? Other countries like Oman, for example?
Going back again to the principle of the establishment of the UAE, I think one of its many successes lies in the fact that it is a federal system. And from an environmental perspective, that also works very, very well. So the Environment Agency is the competent authority that works on environmental issues on behalf of the federal authority in Abu Dhabi. The Ministry of Climate Change and Environment is the federal organization that ensures that we don't just look within the borders of Abu Dhabi. As you said, birds have no passports. Well, actually, they do in the UAE. Falcons do, and then we'll tell you this fascinating story of falconry and passports and borders. But essentially, there is that very strong framework of local and federal. But of course, you know, like with everything, there's tension. And I think that's good. There's healthy tension, there's healthy debates, but it works. Now, in terms of working across our borders, we also have a good history and some very good examples and case studies for us at the Environment Agency and really at the UAE level, working with countries in the region. One of them, I was just looking at the photos, and you would see there was one photograph with an antelope. So there's been a very big program on the conservation of the Arabian oryx. And of course, the range of the Arabian oryx is around the GCC. So the Environment Agency, we've developed a concept called the World Herd. We work on 4 species, the Arabian oryx, the sand gazelle, and the mountain gazelle, as well as the scimitar horned oryx. This is and what we do is we've been breeding them. We've been getting collections from various GCC collectors, and then we release them back into the wild. We've established the Arabian Oryx Secretariat. We've released Arabian Oryx in Saudi, in Oman, in Jordan. And just as we speak, we've got some oryx that we've released for the first time in their history back to where they originally existed in Chad. That's a fascinating story. I'm not quite sure we have enough time to go through that, but essentially this animal ceased to exist in its original country and its original home of Chad. But the UAE had a private collection. We were able to breed them. We were able to have donations from various institutes around the world, including the Smithsonian Institute. And 25 scimitar horned oryx traveled 2 weeks ago from Abu Dhabi to Chad for the first time. It's a sort of a real Madagascar story. Yeah.
The first time I heard micro-philanthropy was when I visited Razan and Fred, and we spoke in Abu Dhabi, and I think they probably should copyright it because it's a fascinating concept. So they are the first organization that I'm aware of, and I think we can claim you to be the first organization that has come up with this concept as a way of preserving species. And in their case, it's not a particular species, but it's across the board. So I'm going to ask you to explain, first of all, what microphilanthropy means and how it works. And second, tell us a little bit about, obviously, the Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Foundation.
So I'll take my Environment Agency hat off, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund, which is very close to both of our hearts. We've been involved with it since its inception. It was launched in 2008 as a significant philanthropic endowment dedicated for species conservation. And you may think at that time, you know, maybe what's the big deal? There's so many different international conservation organizations. But it actually was established at a time where it was a big deal. And the reason why it was a big deal is many of the traditional conservation organizations were dealing with issues and continue to deal with important issues such as climate change, poverty alleviation, development issues. And as a consequence, species conservation and support for individuals working on species on the ground was declining. And having worked with species in Abu Dhabi, having recognized the importance of monitoring, of being on the ground, His Highness the Crown Prince wanted to set up a foundation that will support individuals putting boots on the ground, people who are working directly on species conservation globally. But the idea was a little money can go a long way. It wasn't just about big financial investments in big programs across the world. It was actually looking at reaching the individual who have dedicated their lives to, I'll give you an example, to fireflies, for example, in Malaysia, who needed support and needed that recognition and that nudge. So the endowment fund was established, and it's a grant-making body. It looks at two categories of grants, up to 5,000 is one category, and then up to 25,000. And so far, we've supported how many? 1,300 projects around the world. And it's this notion of, again, micro-philanthropy, using technology to enable access to these individuals from across the world. Yes, we do take risks, but we believe taking a risk, taking a $5,000 risk or a maximum of a $25,000 risk is a risk that we accept if it's actually reaching that individual and that individual is being recognized for protecting a species that he or she love. So really that was the essence of the fund. It was a fund that was concerned it was concerned about nature, but it was also concerned about the people that protect nature.
So we are dealing like, I mean, everybody dealing with species conservation people know that they are a little bit off in most cases, in the way that they are really passionate people who will, in some extent, do whatever they can to protect what they love. And one of the group of species that we were interested right from the beginning, we found it very charismatic, is the cat. Now, in species conservation, lions, tigers, cheetah, leopard have a lot of supporters. I mean, it's a group of species which is very, very well known, charismatic, appealing to a lot of people, so quite well endowed in terms of financial support and, I think, people support. But the small cats, there are actually 18 species of small cats, receive very little attention, except for one person, an American scientist who was, I can say his name, yeah?
Sure.
Jim Sanderson, who was one of your code cracker in Los Alamos for a number of years. And he's a mathematical genius and worked there for a number of years, doing a lot of stuff that he cannot talk about. But one day he decided that enough was enough. And he basically dropped everything. He resigned from his position. He sold his house. He let his pension, I think you said your 501, your pension scheme?
401k.
Yeah, 1K. Sold everything and create a small endowment fund with all that money to spend his life doing small cat conservation. He was completely unknown from the conservation world, being considered a little bit as a bit loopy, but he did it. And 25 years after, he's never worked ever since. He's always financing himself with this money that he gathered. He manages his endowment and his fund himself.
But he is a mathematical genius.
But he is a mathematical. And he is now one of our board of advisors deciding on small cat conservation.
So when we received his first application, what struck me the most about it, and it also gives you a feel of who we're dealing with and why it's so important to recognize these individuals, is we have a question that says, how long is your project going to be running for? And, typically you have 1 year, typically, or between 1 to 5 years. So Jim wrote until my last dying breath. So it was very difficult not to
help him.
to help and to help and support.
Yeah.
One of the angles that the MBZ fund took very early on is that it wanted to look at species that people didn't know much about. So a lot of the big conservation organizations were focused on your endangered species and not necessarily on data deficient species. So we looked at some of those things. We also funded the really boring stuff. So a lot of the times you have these fantastic projects that would have, for example, a vehicle that was funded by another organization to do and continue to do monitoring or anti-poaching protocols. But then they'd have no funding for fuel or no funding for boots, literally. And so this is the kind of things that we fund.
Who was the inspiration to, it's like you say, people pick the big conservations, the popular ones, endangered. Whose idea was it to go after? I mean, who was the leadership that to go after these unique?
I think it was a combination of things, and that's very much rooted in what we expressed before from the leadership in the UAE. Somebody like a crown prince is somebody who is very in tune with the environment and species. And one of the things he wanted to be able to do when creating that fund, that was reported to me when we bounced the idea of creating that, is that he didn't want to have a fund or a philanthropy or a cause by which or in which he would not be able to speak about it himself. So he wanted to be able to grab a cause that relate to him and that he understood and be able to be himself totally committed to. He's a keen falconer. He's somebody who has always been involved with species conservation, with a group of people who were at the beginning of a lot of the environmental movement in Abu Dhabi and in the region. And that was something that matters. Then you had a number of other minds who look at it and say, okay, where could be the most impact, which is also respectful from the donor, the philanthropy. So a lot of the conservation organization, as it's explained a little bit in the movie, are now moving on a big driver of extinction, climate change, pollution, globalization, a lot of this wildlife trade, which are extremely important, but remove ourselves a little bit from the direct contact at the ground level between the species and the people. Okay? And we wanted to keep that alive. Not that we think that the other issues are not important, but we feel that it's very important to keep and to support people in developing countries to be able to continue working their passion. And very often, a small grant, 5 to 25,000, it's nothing here, it's nothing in Europe. But in a country like in Africa, for example, it goes a long way. In the movie, you see somebody with the slippery frog. Yeah? This person is totally uneducated and is born in that forest when the only population of that frog is still living. And he wanted to do something about it. He heard about us, I don't know how, but we were the first grant he found enough courage to apply to. And we said, okay, go for it. He's now having 5 or 6 grants from us. He's been able to leverage by a factor of 10 what he's been receiving from us. He's now being part of larger organization as one of the only person who knows that frog. And that's very important. If we don't have these kind of people supported right at the beginning, they might end up doing a career in somewhere else. And we lose this contact with the species. So that's really what is at the core, as Razan explained, people and species. We are the largest donor, which is not very difficult to be actually, in the fungi conservation community. Now, it's funny, but this is a group of species which have millions of species, most of them undescribed, and very often at the core of a lot of ecosystem services that we have. There are also some of these species that we rely on to find new drugs to cure a number of disease, but we don't know about it. So we founded 3 or 4 academicians working on that, and since we founded that, I think the overall fund we distribute was about $50,000 in 2 or 3 times. We created a group of close to 120 specialists who are now working on assessing, cataloging, describing this kind of fungi in different ways. Yeah, Razan, you want
No.
something?
Other questions, comments? Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, Razan, Fred, inspiring. And we had a chance to work together on Wadi Waraya, and a theme that's come up a lot in the work that we're doing in other countries too. And we have like 1/3 of the world is protected at this point, but the sustainability, just from a financial perspective, to keep the conservation, the protection, the enforcement, is not there. The architecture is not there. The question, and we talk about small grants, but $5,000, it's amazing to create that connection, but then what do they do next, right? I mean, what's your current thinking? I guess generally it'd be very interesting to learn, but also in the Middle East about establishing protected areas and then endowing them in a way that actually could last to the next generation.
What we found is what the fund is the first believer. So people come to us when they haven't gotten support necessarily from other organizations. And once they have a track record with the fund, they're able to then leverage other institutions. So a number of our grantees have leveraged, the gentleman working in Congo on the slippery frog is somebody who's leveraged 10 times the amount of money that we first invested in him. And we see that very much as a trend. Now, in terms of using that concept for an overall nature conservation, is certainly something very interesting and not new in certain parts of the world. In Abu Dhabi, and Aaron, you're very humble, but you've helped me and helped us really set up one of the first environmental non-government organization, Emirates Wildlife Society, when you were based out of Dubai. So thank you very much. Essentially, you have to look at a diversity of models. Not every model works everywhere. In Abu Dhabi, we're starting a model of looking at private operators, whereby they pay you a conservation fee where you can continue to do your monitoring, but at the same time, they provide access to tourists that are able to go and see a beautiful area, have access to scientists, get to see the real thing. And through this investment and through this model, we're able to continue to fund our work. And again, in some places it works, and in other places not so much. I don't know, Fred, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I think, as you know, one of the challenges we have in the Middle East in terms of protected area in particular, but environment in general, is that still now the general public and the people living in the country rely more or less exclusively on the government to take care of the environment or the protected area, to establish, run, and enjoy the protected area. And that is a critical transition to do, involve others into the establishment, care, and operation of some of this natural environment and species. The first things the Environment Agency is doing under Razan's leadership, and because I know that she believes really much into that, is to actually opening up, the first level is actually open up the protected area to people, which so far a lot of the protected area in the Middle East are still not known from the resident and the general public. They are known from a few who have access to it, but in general, it's not like your national park here or what you found they are not part of the society, I would say, as such. And the first things we have to do is to open up, make the people aware of those, enjoying those, experiencing them, and then become an advocate for more, or a better management, or so on, to find a relay so that ease the burden on the government. Sometimes we have a fight to establish protected area, but also be more encompassing into the overall management and create an ownership for all about the resources and the natural resources in the countries.
Thank you all for coming. And Razan, I really think you're truly as an Emirati, you're truly a role model. And my question is just a follow-up on what Frederic said. How does the environmental agency, if you can tell us about like the community awareness programs you guys have, and or how do you incorporate some of these programs with schools or like the educational systems? Thank you.
Thank you for mentioning that, because it truly is an important component of what we do. So, as I mentioned before, we work like any maybe a little bit different from traditional environmental organization, but the approach is similar. So you do your monitoring, you do your policy work, you do your evaluation, you put your regulations together, and then you enforce. But underpinning all of that, you need really three key things. One is data and information. So today, when scientists can go out and collect information and data, but the trend is to involve people in data collection. The notion of citizen science is extremely important. And today, with the technology that's available, many people can participate. So in Abu Dhabi, for example, we have a program that allows people to support us with bird counts, for example, where they have the opportunity to help us with describing certain species that they've seen, but also describing certain environmental pollution incidents that they've also to report on those. So information is extremely important. The second element is really education. And education, for us, it really, and our approach is that it's at all levels. So it's not really making any assumptions that people are aware and people know. It's really making sure that we provide information to the population. But in terms of schools, we're very much engaged. We have a sustainability schools initiative, whereby schools get engaged. They have to create an environmental club. The environmental club has to have representation from the community. They end up learning about how to measure their footprint as a school or as a campus, and devise strategies to reduce that. The third element is really research and development. So really working with universities and with the community and young entrepreneurs, really sitting and describing some of the environmental challenges that we face, and waiting to see some of the solutions that come out of the community. So really it's quite holistic. It's informing, engaging, but also empowering in terms of really looking at some of those solutions.
And Razan, earlier you mentioned the fact that you were trying to develop among Emiratis this sense of national pride in their environment. How do you deal with a large expatriate population that maybe doesn't have that immediate sense of ownership in developing, and what's the messaging that you deliver to that community?
No, I mean, we can discuss it. I mean, I really genuinely believe that what makes the UAE an exciting place is its diversity in its population. And yes, people come in with different perspectives of what nature means. Is nature going into a zoo, or is nature really protecting something that you don't even know? So there's certainly various, and there's challenges. I mean, when we do environmental campaigns, what language do we use? And we end up really looking at a multiple language campaigns, and it's not easy, and particularly in a financially constrained world, to be able to go out there and do that. But it is challenging. Certainly, that's a challenge. But the opportunity is the fact that, yeah, people have different ideas for conservation and environmental protection. And if you provide the right platform, people come together. And we do believe, and you might think, me naive, but there is this kind of beautiful humanity when it comes to nature conservation. It actually brings people together. When we host environmental clubs in the UAE, and we have environmental clubs from across the UAE, again, various nationalities, religions, backgrounds, but they all really come together with this notion of solidarity when it comes to conservation.
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge, nonetheless, but this is something which is not new, and there is way to do it. It just takes time, and it evolves. The perception of the people on the UAE is evolving. I think people generally have, in general, have a kind of a keenness for the environment they live in. In the UAE, close to 90% of the population, both local and expatriate, are actually living in cities. So the first hurdle we have is beyond nationality, is to reconnect the urban dweller with the natural environment. That's the main thing, and that basically taking them out there and making them experience that there is other things than Dubai skyline or Abu Dhabi beach in the UAE. It's much more varied than that. After, the challenge we have very often with the expatriate community is that they do have a keenness on the environment, but they are bringing their own solution, which is very much, in my home country, this is how we address protected area. This is how we protect species. This is how we approach animal welfare issue, which is always an issue we have in the UAE. And we have different mindset, and as Razan said, different culture, different things. We have a lot of, the most vocal expatriate community in terms of environment and animal welfare is a Western expatriate community. And very often we have a very Anglo-Saxon approach on that, which is we have place for nature and we have place for people. And the two don't mix. And a lot of the conservation movement is actually based on creating sanctuary, which are priority for wildlife and natural space, and space which are priority for people. The Middle East has not have this mindset. Everything is mixed together. I mean, one of my earlier mentor in the UAE always says there is no desert without people, and there is no people without desert. And it's very much that. The desert without people does not exist. It's one, and they belong to each other. So our conservation approach is very different. We have homegrown solution that needs to be placed, accepted, and obviously implemented. So one challenge is to argue those, explain those, and illustrate those. And as we said before, it is a rapidly evolving environment from a socio-economic perspective. When I reached in the UAE in 25 years ago, the population was half of what it is now. So a huge, huge challenge there. It is possible to overcome. We are doing, a lot of progress has been done, but it will always be these things that we need to find, like everywhere else, homegrown solution that are really specific to the environment we have, as well as the makeup of the society as a whole. So we are experimenting different things, but education awareness is key. A certain level of awareness for UAE national population, which is sustained and grow as the child and then young person evolve through their curriculum and life. With the expatriate community, every year you have to start again because there is a very high turnover. So your investment on the young people is not something you will capitalize for the next 30 or 40 years. You will deal with different people. So it's a constant repetition of the same thing, basically.
A few years ago, I had the opportunity to work in Abu Dhabi for a couple of months. And I just wanted to comment quickly on a couple things you said. First of all, when you spoke about the longevity of some of the employees, I found that Abu Dhabi was a wonderful place for an older person to work, that there was a respect for age, and I don't always find that here, and I really came away feeling good about that part of your culture. Another thing I noticed there was a day when the national newspaper had a headline about mountain lions in danger, and it was like either the next day or the day after. The headline was, Crown Prince commits, $25,000, whatever the amount was, to saving the mountain lion, and it just blew me away how quickly the response was, because as you know, in this country, it takes a long time, to get through all the bureaucracy to make a change, but it was just so quick. And lastly, I want to applaud you for considering public transit in your overall scheme, because I think that's really important to environmental protection. Thank you.
Other comments, questions? I have one question for you. I think when I was in the UAE, I always felt that it was a country that was blessed with good leadership. And I think very few of us who've lived in the UAE could ignore the fact that it was really Sheikh Zayed who had this incredible passion for protecting the environment, for making the country green, for really trying to pass that. So I guess the question I have is, what makes a small country like the UAE want to have such a global role in conservation? Is it very personal for the Sheikh Zayed, or in this case now it's been passed to his son, Sheikh Mohamed bin Zayed? Or is this becoming part of the national identity that you feel you as a country have to play a role?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's to a certain extent, I've been brought up with it, so it's very difficult for me to analyze it. But from a very kind of pragmatic level, when the species conservation movement started in the UAE, it started with birds, and birds had no boundaries, and particularly with falconry. So when studying the migratory routes of falcons, from the UAE into China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, there was no doubt to conserve the falcon, you had to work with the range countries to conserve their habitats, their breeding grounds, their feeding grounds, and so forth. So for me, the path of the falcon was the start to a local awakening for the need for global conservation. So there's that. And then also growing up in a very international context, whereby, when you go to school, the UAE population is only, compromises 10% or, 10 to 15% of the overall UAE population. So more often than not, you're mixing with many, many different cultures. And therefore, your outlook is always been very global and always been quite international. Today in my office, I interact with so many different nationalities. And while, yes, there are certain challenges, there's, you read the books on cultural stereotypes and how to overcome them in the office space. And yeah, sure, they do exist. But at the same time, genuinely for me, it does give me a platform of opportunities and of what's worked, what hasn't. And really going back to the quote of Sheikh Zayed, it's really understanding not just our own past, but the past of our neighbors and other countries, and really using that as a springboard for ideas. So I'm quite comfortable maybe potentially with this analysis, but I don't know if Fred, you as somebody who is French and been living in the UAE for so long. By the way, Fred's name in the UAE is Abdullah al-Faransi. He's been coined.
Yeah, it was that of
That's a great title. I like that.
No, I think, yeah, I mean, I obviously cannot speak on as an Emirati national, but I mean, there is always also in the UAE a kind of generosity which is directed in sharing what good you have with others. And that across, it's not only in the environmental arena. There is a lot of issues where the UAE has been sharing right from the beginning with others. And for a very long time, a lot of things, very good things were done in the UAE, which were not broadcast or not advertised. It was not a PR exercise at all. It was just done. I mean, the things that Razan mentioned on the Falcon and things, that goes on for 20 years, but it's only very recently that people start to talk about it and be proud about it. But there is a long standing efforts and support in humanitarian assistance, development with countries around the region, which hasn't been really advertised, but it was there because I think right from the beginning, people consider in the UAE that they were gifted for a number of advantage and they needed to share with others. I mean, the overall society is based on that. But as the country matures, the institution mature, then your level of confidence increase also, so you become a little bit more keen on saying what you do, and you are encouraged to formalize these presentations through being part in other forum. So now the UAE is much more active in the UN system, in the international conservation movement, in the Sustainable Development Goal, I mean, in a number of things, because you have now a number of younger generation like Razan who've been born and raised with this international dimension. Everything is based on friendship as personal connection. So you have friends from the US, you have friends from Europe and so on. So you tend to relate to them also and share. But also the institutions now are much more mature and are able now to establish strategy, be able to pick priorities issues where they think they've got something to bring. They also have a maturity that allow institutions to, in international forum, to say more clearly what they do not want from the international arena. They are not going to stand and say, no, yeah, tell me what I need to do. There is something, a level of confidence and maturity which has been achieved, but which put the UAE at the level at an international. Also, UAE, right from the beginning, has always been, right from the beginning, a trade center. Yeah. It's a coastal society, pearl diving, merchant coming from in Dubai Creek. That was the reason why Dubai was established. Alain Oasis was also a trade center with a neighbor, the frankincense, the caravan, and all that. So it's always been an area with a lot of exchange, and the international level is very important, and it's really rooted in the values and the identity of the country and the people.
This has been really interesting. I do have a question about specifically conservation in the Emirates and in Abu Dhabi in particular. I mean, there have to be moments, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine, I find it very hard to imagine this couldn't be the case, where there's tension between an idea that centers on development and a counter idea that centers on protecting the environment. What sort of arguments do you use? I mean, do you rely on the idea of long-term sustainability and things like that? I mean, what are your essential techniques do you employ in trying to get your way in those arguments? And I mean, I'd really be interested to know if there was ever a time when your side kind of lost the argument, and what happened in the long run. I mean, have lessons been learned? In most societies, mistakes are made and lessons are learned. Could you tell us about both of those things, please?
For sure, there are key challenges, and there are battles which have been lost by the Environment Agency. I mean, I would say many battles, small and big. But contrary to maybe something that can be thought about is that there is a debate. It's not instruction and do it and nothing happen. There is a debate. The debate is in different form. It's not necessarily on the public space, but it is happening, and sometimes it's very heated debate, and Razan can attest on that. And we need to, basically it's a case by case, project by project, issue by issue. I'll give you one example that we've been, I will give you two. One we won, one we don't know yet. But the one we won was we engaged early on a survey on coral reef that was done through the Emirates Wildlife Society and EAD in the entire Abu Dhabi Emirates, in the idea of mapping, understanding the area we did have. And we found out that in some areas we had a very rich coral patch, which was very important for the other coral patch, but also for the local fisheries. That happened to be smack at the place where the new Khalifa port was supposed to be built. Okay. We didn't know that, but we had in our board a number of people which were very well aware of that situation. So they asked us to provide the result of our work, and through their own channel directly took it to the power to be, and the port was actually moved 10 kilometers away from the coral before any EIA, before any formal process, before anything happened. So we were very proud of ourselves, even if we didn't do much, but we had the I would say at that time the courage to say, well, you have something valuable here that needs to, and something needs to be done about it. And that happened. So that's one of the things. The other thing, which is a little bit more mitigated, is that we have a number of coastal asset in terms of mangroves and so on and so forth, but obviously the pressure on the coast is very high. That's where most of the infrastructure is being built. That's where most of your tourism infrastructure is being built. So it's a very high demand. So we thought, like a lot of other organizations worldwide, that we needed to add a component based on ecosystem services and valuation of the natural resources we did have. So we did extensive studies on mangrove, seagrass bed, and so on, giving a value of this environment.
A dollar value.
A dollar value,
Yeah.
okay? Expecting, and we were happy because we had a big number. Now, we presented this big number to people which were involved at the decision, the planning level. And their answer were, why on earth are you giving me a dollar value for that piece of environment, whereby the dollar value you gave me is very little compared to what I can get from an industry or a 5-star hotel and so on. But now that you give me this dollar value, I have no choice than to go as a leader in the community to go with a higher number. And which is not the one you want. And we were told, don't give me that dollar value because it put me in trouble. In that particular case, insist on the identity value for this piece of land because that has no value. And as a leader of the community, I can defend that point, which I won't be able to do it if we compare dollar for dollars. So we don't know if we lost entirely the fight on that one, but we certainly learned a kind of a lesson there, that sometime we need to use, and the identity is extremely important there. However, economic requirements are such that we are losing battle, but we can again find combination of solution that will involve a certain level of economic development. So very often our pitch is how you develop more than should you develop. If we start from that angle, very often we lose the battle. But if we said, okay, let's work together to make it better for each, we have some wins.
Just two anecdotes that I'm really interested in, if you develop them a little bit. As someone who's been on an Emirates flight all the way in the back of the flight, and while a bird is sitting comfortably in first class, what is the deal with Falcon passports? So if you can elaborate on that one.
That's all yours.
And then the other one, the other question is on the oryx from Chad. How did you come in possession of the herd, the small herd, and what other endangered species do you have also that you can reintroduce in the wild?
Yeah. Okay, anecdotes. Many anecdotes when it comes to falcons, but it goes, maybe I think it goes without saying how important falconry is from a cultural perspective to the not just the UAE but to the region. Very, very important. There's so many sayings that are associated with falconry, poems, historical narratives. I mean, really, this is a major part of the discourse when it comes to environmental conservation. So, but at the same time, you have a convention called the Convention called CITES, which manages and regulates the movement of animals and species from countries, and essentially manages this trade. And so falcons were being smuggled in the UAE because of the and the region because of the high demand on wild falcons. So we addressed it by looking at two things. One is, again, we established a falcon hospital, one of the largest in the world, that also falls under the mandate of the Environment Agency. And what we tried to do is wean people away from getting and acquiring wild falcons to acquiring captive bred falcons that we would breed in the UAE. Now, to be able to differentiate which falcon is what and where did they come from, we wanted to also establish an identity card. So we established the Falcon passport, which is very, very well designed, I have to say. But that certainly was one of the, from at least from my career perspective, that's one of the first things we started with. The UAE was placed under a suspension. Trade suspension under this convention. And it's amazing when you are under that type of trade suspension, you end up realizing the number of goods and services we have from species. And the two major areas that the UAE was struggling with the issue of falcons and the issue of caviar. not bad in terms of the types of species that we were dealing with, but certainly very interesting. And we had to come up with innovative ways to ensure that the categorization, the documentation of those types of species were done properly, so that that can enable regulation and enforcement. What was the second one?
The oryx.
Scimitar horned oryx. I'll leave that to you.
Yeah. On the first one, also, one of the things is that the solution you have to come up with should be internationally acceptable and within the international legal framework of CITES, but should also respect the tradition of falconry. I mean, one thing which is not negotiable in the UAE is that to question the practice of falconry. So this is something that is going to continue, and this is something that is critically important from a cultural point of view. And the falconer from the UAE, as most of the falconer in the GCC, are actually people who are not hunting only in their own respective country. They hunt abroad. So during a hunting season, the same bird can move up and down and go out and in the country several times. So until that time, each time, internationally, it was recorded as a different bird. Okay, and each time a falconer was going out with his bird, he needed to apply for an export permit from the country he was going and an import permit from the country he was coming back to. Okay, so you imagine the number of things. The trip sometime happened, it was 2 or 3 days. Nightmare. The number of falcon traded was absolutely horrendous. So we had to come up with a system which was respecting of all that, and the falcon passport. So now all the passport in the UAE, all the falcon in the UAE are marked. They are all microchipped. They all have an identity card. They all have an owner. And if they travel, they are issued a passport, which is issued only in a registered center like the Falcon Hospital, and the bird is checked and so on and so forth. So that was one of the things. The scimitar oryx, most of these oryx, scimitar oryx is a species that does not occur in the UAE. It's purely North African species, extinct in the wild. And most of the individual in the UAE were obtained through, I would say, royal gift, when a president from a country was using to come visiting the UAE. Very often, it's oryx, gazelle, a number of things. It's less the case now, but in the 60s, 70s, that was part of the thing, especially people knowing the keenness of Sheikh Zayed, the late Sheikh Zayed, with wildlife. So we inherited a number of collection of animals like that, but they were actually growing because they were not left in somewhere. They were actually managed and work. So the environmental agency alone is now holding close to 19,000 scimitar horned oryx, which is a species extinct in the wild. So it's a huge resources, resources, and when we have other species like that, not in that big number, but these oryx are like rabbit. They breed very quickly, and the environment in the UAE is very much similar to the one they have. So it was taken care of at that level. But immediately the recognition now that we have the expertise, we have the knowledge, we have the know-how to take care not only of breeding and keeping these oryx alive, but we have now the knowledge and expertise, probably like unlike many other countries, to actually move large numbers of animals anywhere. I mean, a lot of the... now we are teaching, and we are very proud of that. We had people from the Smithsonian with us. We had people from UK. We had people from a number of places, and it's actually us who are now training them to move oryx in different places, the way because we are the only one handling so many of these animals. So we do not have anymore this fear of breaking one leg and just looking at one individual like if it's the most precious. We know how to manage those animals in big number and so on and so forth. But that's how the collection came.
Of course, you guys are doing a great job in the UAE so far from what we've heard. But knowing that the population in Abu Dhabi will triple in 15 years from now, how do you perceive how do you forecast the future of Abu Dhabi? How grim, if it is a grim, do you feel you guys are equipped enough to deal with that kind of scenario? Population is that's unusual. 3 times in 15 years is probably unheard of. So are you concerned about the environment in Abu Dhabi? Are you ready to face the worst case scenario?
No, I mean, this is what motivates us to show up to work. It's not just the good stories. Certainly the challenges are, like you've mentioned, it's high population in an environment that is actually very difficult. We have no fresh water. We will have to, and we do today, desalinate our water, and 100% of our consumption of potable water is from desalination, which, as you know, is energy intensive. We live in a hot climate, so air conditioning and the need for air conditioning is extremely important. So yes, certainly these are challenges. When we talk about food security, in a context again of water scarcity, is something that is very high on the agenda. Now, yeah, technology won't solve everything. There are limits to growth. And, but one of the opportunities, as Fred was saying, is because we have 90% of people living in cities, the city needs to be part of the solution. And so our response to that is we have Masdar, that is sort of a mini experiment of the type of city that we can build, that we can then import into the overall infrastructure for Abu Dhabi. So we're looking at different building techniques. We're looking at various waste strategy techniques. And we use that in a microcosm within Masdar, and then we see how we can actually implement it in the wider Abu Dhabi and the UAE stream. But it's certainly very challenging because of the pace. It's certainly very challenging because of the fact that we have such a low biocapacity and that we have to import a lot of our food. An interesting area that we're really looking into now is really when it comes to water. So one is really looking at, even though today the UAE, because it developed later, we leapfrog and we have the best available desalination technology, but it's not enough. So really looking at leapfrogging that even further and looking at how we can use renewable energy to help us with desalination. Another interesting one that we're doing is because of desalination technology, and most of the desalination technology that we use in the UAE is cogeneration, so it produces both water and electricity. But then there's a difference. Sometimes we produce more water than we need, particularly in the summer, because electricity demand is so high. So what we're trying to also do is develop these aquifer reserves. So re-inject excess water back into the aquifer. And therefore, what we're trying to do is recharge our groundwater levels. But we also recognize that we cannot address some of those scarcity issues just with adding more and more supply. It's not sustainable. So really looking at demand-side management strategies, working, and we're from an environmental perspective, we were very happy that there was a major reduction on the subsidy of water and electricity. that will help us manage our demand in terms of water and electricity. We're also looking at, and that will drive essentially efficiency. So we hope with the combination of technologies so that we are able to supply some of these vital resources differently and more effectively. And of course, with the combination of demand-side management strategies, we'll be able to address some of those issues, but it is extremely, extremely challenging. Not easy, but interesting.
Yeah, I think we're probably have run out of time, so I would like to thank Razan Al Mubarak very much, and I very much appreciate the time you took to come here. Razan is in the U.S. because she's heading a delegation that is looking at the management of hazardous waste.
Yes.
So we grabbed her and asked her to come and speak maybe about more, hopefully fun topics,
Yeah.
but also very challenging. I think you've outlined a lot of your achievements, and I think with especially the answer to the last question, you've highlighted the huge challenges that you face in a country that's developing as rapidly as the UAE. Fred, also thank you very much for joining us, for taking the time, and for sharing with us some of the great stories of the MBZ Conservation Fund. We appreciate that. I would like to invite all of you to join us for a bite to eat and some beverages. Thank you again, Razan, and Fred.
Thank you.
Thank you.